Now, the title I've been given is Fissures in the Atlantic or in Europe, and I'd like to start out by saying quite clearly that I don't think it's an either or, because there are obviously fissures in both. And following the last speaker's remarks, I would like to concentrate on the European perspectives and then turn to consider some of the transatlantic implications. Now, I've identified three principal fissures that I want to think about this morning. The first are the fissures between the EU member states, and historically this has tended to divide the member states along what I'll call Atlanticist and European lines. The second fissure is that between the European Union, the accession countries, and the candidates. And the final one is the fissures in transatlantic relations and with other international governmental organizations such as NATO and the United Nations. Now, let me say, by way of introduction to these fissure themes, that I don't think the Iraq crisis has actually caused these fissures. It has, however, been a catalyst and has given stark relief to many of the fissures that I think were already underlying European cooperation, or lack thereof, in a wide array of external relations topics. It's also evident that the Iraq crisis came at a very awkward time for the European Union. I think, as many of you know, we have embarked upon an extensive rethink of how the European institutions should look to prepare for enlargement in May of next year, when the EU will expand from 15 to 25 member states. We were preparing, as the phrase goes, for institutional finalité of the Union. And this was obviously accompanied by a good deal of wider thinking about the European Union's role in the world. Indeed, external relations has been one of the central topics in this Convention on the Future of the EU. So it's naturally somewhat embarrassing to have the gap between rhetoric and reality exposed rather dramatically by this crisis. I am, however, and this may be a little bit surprising, rather optimistic that most of the fissures I've described can be overcome. And I think, on the whole, the Iraq crisis may prove to be a rather helpful thing in the longer term for both the European Union and for transatlantic relations. Let me commence then with some consideration of the first fissure that I mentioned in relation to the Iraq crisis. That is the fissures between the member states. The obvious problem in this regard is why the EU member states failed to work together and why they failed to work through the common institutions and mechanisms that they themselves had established. For the students present who may not know this, it's perhaps necessary to explain briefly that there are several components of the European Union. There is the old community, which used to be called the European Economic Community, which basically allows the member states to cede sovereignty in certain areas to the community, which acts on their behalf. And this leads to the so-called acquis communautaire. However, external relations are intergovernmental. The so-called common foreign and security policy relies upon reaching consensus between the members. It is part of the Union, but it is distinct in many ways from the community, which means that there are no legal mechanisms to force the member states to work through the common foreign and security policy. And this indeed proved to be the first real problem that the EU faced. The member states simply disregarded, by and large, their treaty-based commitments to work through the common foreign and security policy and to support it in a spirit of mutual solidarity and loyalty. This is indeed a pattern that you can find not just in the Iraq crisis, but other crises in recent years in the Balkans, where by and large the common foreign and security policy was put to the side in favour of various ad hoc cooperation mechanisms such as the six-member contact group. The finger is often pointed at France and Germany as being the chief culprits for sidelining the EU in the whole response to the Iraq crisis. However, I think to be fair, that Blair's role was hardly honourable in this regard either, since the UK reached its national position very quickly, consulted with allies in Washington, all working around the common foreign and security policy, and in particular the High Representative for CFSP, Javier Solana. The smaller member states felt that they were not adequately consulted by the larger member states, and they were denied the chance to really reach a consensual position, if one was possible, on this particular crisis. Now, my argument is not that had they worked through the EU mechanisms, it would have necessarily have changed the outcome, but nevertheless, the opportunity to reach consensus in the first place through the EU mechanisms would have greatly strengthened the common foreign and security policy. This may appear to be a very damning indictment of the common foreign and security policy. Indeed, some see it as the virtual end of the common foreign and security policy. As the adage goes, there's no common, there's no security, there's no policy, it's all foreign. However, I think this is a rather dangerous perspective because it induces a certain kind of myopia by making the Iraq crisis equatable with the future of the common foreign and security policy. And it's worth pointing out that during the Iraq crisis, a number of quite significant for us developments took place that give me room for some optimism about the EU's future role in crisis management and conflict prevention. Two things are worth mentioning very briefly. In the first place, in January of this year, the EU took over a UN peace mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And in the second place, in March of this year, the EU assumed the old NATO duties in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia in Operation Concordia, run in close collaboration with NATO. It's also worth noting that the common foreign and security policy is not EU external relations. There are many other areas dealt with by the community, such as trade, aid, and development to third parties. And although there are some problems in this area, by and large it works very well and gives the EU a visible role on the international stage. And the common foreign and security policy is obviously an important part of framing the EU's international role. And if we reach the conclusion that CFSP is all but dead, we damage EU external relations in general. Let me turn now to the fissures between the accession countries and the candidates that were exposed as a result of this crisis. Of all the fissures that developed, this, I think, was the most needless and could have been avoided. The catalyst for these fissures were some remarks made by President Chirac in mid-February that, to my mind, can only be described as extraordinary. It was an outburst where he described the accession countries and the candidates as badly brought up children, with a clear message that he expected that on issues such as this, they should fall in line as predominantly smaller member states who wish to join the European Union soon. And this has opened up a very interesting debate in the EU about whether enlargement of the EU is going to decisively change the nature of EU's external relations, and particularly the common foreign and security policy. The point is often made that the EU in this area is soon going to be Atlanticized with the accession of firm pro-Atlanticist supporters. But this is a curious concern for two reasons, I think. The first is that the EU is already Atlanticized. There have been historic supporters of a strong NATO role and a strong involvement of the United States and Canada in EU external relations, and in particular the UK is mentioned in this regard, but there are others as well, such as the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. The second reason why it's a curious observation that this is going to radically change the European Union is that it assumes that there is an incompatibility between being good Europeans and supporting an active role for the Atlantic Alliance in European external relations. Indeed, the history that the accession countries bring to the European Union means that they do not have a problem with this apparent dichotomy. There is no problem in being a good European and an active supporter of the Atlantic Alliance. Poland is an obvious example of this. So I'm hoping that these largely avoidable differences between the accession countries, the candidates, and the member states can be addressed very soon in a constructive manner, because it is too late to stop enlargement. It is a process that is going ahead very quickly. The referenda on the part of the accession countries, I think 4 have taken place already, 6 have to go, and it's unlikely that there will be any member state who will say no. Then lastly, perhaps the most serious fissures are those that have emerged in transatlantic relations and relations with international governmental organizations. To start off with, I think that our thinking on transatlantic relations has been oversimplified, and in this regard I would disagree slightly with the previous speaker, because I think Kagan's thoughts, which are immensely popular in Europe as they are in North America, are very entertaining and make a wonderful read. But however, they lead to rather crude stereotypes. And if you do agree with the Venus and Mars analogy, it was Javier Solana who reminded us that the offspring of Venus and Mars was, of course, Harmonia. I prefer a more complicated picture of transatlantic relations, because there are hawks to be found in Europe, just as there are doves in the US Congress. I do, however, agree with the observation that we in Europe perhaps do not understand the full impact of 9/11 on American thinking and security perspectives. It was a traumatic event that we obviously watched with horror and concern ourselves, and the support that was shown by the European Union for the US in the immediate aftermath of the crisis was genuine and sincere. However, I think it's worth noting that the US needs to understand our preoccupations with our traumatic event. And of course, our event, which shapes our thinking and the shape of Europe today, was November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reshaping that is still going on of Europe. This doesn't mean that there are incompatibilities in the agendas, but merely that we need an enhanced dialogue to understand our concerns and our perspectives on a variety of things, but chiefly global governance. The second important point, I think, when it comes to thinking through the differences that have become evident in transatlantic relations is that it's encouraged a view in Washington that the European Union, particularly in the common foreign and security policy, is somewhat inept and largely to be ignored because the US can cherry pick amongst the EU member states to get what they want in terms of international relations. This may, however, become more difficult fairly soon. And the reason I suggest this is because there are a number of items that are coming up onto the transatlantic agenda where there is far more European solidarity in outlook. And these involve questions such as the roadmap on the Middle East, questions of the role of international law and the United Nations in international relations, the International Criminal Court, and environmental issues. It may be, therefore, rather more difficult for the US to cherry pick in the future, particularly on these issues. And that means that the US has to begin to accept the European Union as a serious international actor and one that has to be addressed as an equal. And this means also that we have to address our differences, because we do see the world differently around us, but we also have commonalities. As long as this is not a dialogue of equals, it's going to be very difficult to reach understanding. This also means that within the EU, we have to be very clear about what the objectives are of the Union, particularly in external relations, to avoid giving the impression in Washington that the European Union is a counterweight to the United States and not a valuable partner. Transatlantic relations also obviously concerns the whole role of NATO. There are a variety of different perspectives in Europe about the utility of NATO. Some say that it stands for no action, talk only. However, it is an institution that is not in opposition to or competition with the European Union. It's often portrayed as an alternative to the European security and defense policy, not a complement to it. Now, I reject this view, and I think the EU and NATO are emerging as very valuable partners. There have been a variety of initiatives recently, including numerous meetings at parallel levels between the civilian and military components of NATO and the European Union. There is an agreement on the exchange of classified information between the two organizations. They have reached agreement as well on a number of technical issues. And I think very importantly, we have seen active involvement of the NATO and the EU in the Balkans. And indeed in Operation Concordia, as I mentioned a moment ago, NATO is actively supporting the European Union in its endeavors there. So the message in this regard would be that complementarity is the message of the day. The EU and NATO need each other, and we also need each other for two additional reasons. One is that NATO has firmly gone out of area. NATO is involved in Afghanistan, and NATO may soon be involved in Iraq as well. There is a very complex debate within the European Union about the geographical scope of our external relations, and particularly the scope of our rapid reaction force. This is cloaked in ambiguity as to whether we are essentially building a regional force or whether this force may be deployable internationally. There is not agreement on this. So having NATO carrying out some international missions and the EU accepting responsibility for more local missions may make a sensible division of labour, at least for the medium term. The second reason for suggesting that there is complementarity between the EU and NATO lies in the dual enlargement. The EU will expand in May of 2004, we hope, and by a remarkable coincidence, so will NATO, expanding from 19 to 26. The EU, meanwhile, will expand to 25, and this means that common membership of the two institutions will go up from 11 to 20. And it's very much part of the hope of the accession countries to the EU and NATO that there will be complementarity between these organizations and they can go on working together. Now, I've obviously avoided a very difficult part of this presentation, and that's the what next question. I have a few ideas, and they are tentative. And the ideas are drawn in part from a number of transatlantic declarations that seem to have been multiplying in recent days. One came out last week from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and there's also another very perceptive one from the Brookings Institution and the Center for European Reform in London. And I would agree with some of their observations. Firstly, on Iraq. It's clear that there has to be a broad understanding on Iraq, with acceptance on the part of the US of a need for a broad bargain on Iraq, which should include United Nations Security Council endorsement for a peacekeeping force. The challenge for Europe is going to be overcoming our objections to the war and the rights and wrongs and the legalities of the war should certainly be debated, but in a proper context. And we should show our willingness to contribute, if called upon, to a NATO peacekeeping force. The second area where transatlantic relations could be built upon is in the implementation of the roadmap on the Middle East. This is clearly a priority from the European perspective, although there are well-publicized differences in perspective within the quartet. It is nevertheless essential to stick to the roadmap and build on common concerns in the region that unite us, stemming from the ongoing Israeli-Palestine problems, such as our broader concerns about the fight against terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Third, there is a need for a dialogue on Iran. And in this regard, the EU has a very valuable role to play, and it's one where the US could perhaps accept more European leadership. And the EU, for its part, must insist upon Iran's observance of the basic conditions for stability in the region, particularly non-proliferation measures. Next, there is a need to build upon the cooperation between the EU and the US on our common concerns about terrorism. Since 9/11, there have been very healthy signs of collaboration across the Atlantic, an active exchange of information through Eurojust and Europol. But this is something that nevertheless needs to be enhanced, and we will have some difficult agenda items to discuss and address, such as privacy. And lastly, I think we need to build upon our common concerns about weapons of mass destruction. And this is certainly something that is receiving heightened awareness in the European Union. There have been several major addresses made by Javier Solana, the High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, recently. This will require adjustment from all sides. It will require the United States to see the European Union as a partner in international relations, and it will require the EU to persuade the United States that it is a constructive partner and it is not trying to emerge as a competitor to the United States. We need each other, and partnership is clearly the road ahead.
Lieutenant Colonel John Blackson from the Australian Army. Dr. Duke, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I want to challenge perhaps your optimism. It struck me that your comments about Robert Kagan's thesis is very interesting, and it echoed in my mind a thought of Dr. Huntington and his thesis on the clash of civilizations, which people have panned across the board in many countries, and yet there's a certain traction, a certain truism to what he has to say that echoes today and has a certain credibility and it gels in certain people's minds. It strikes me also that Robert Kagan's thesis also has a certain truism to it, that as much as you can find holes in the theory, it has traction in reality that makes people believe it to a certain point. And that then leads me to my observations about your comments about the future and where we're heading with the issue of Palestine, the issue of certain other international transatlantic issues that lead me to be not nearly as optimistic as you about where we're heading and what that means for future transatlantic relations and the place of the EU and the role of NATO. Particularly also when you think about the Eastern European countries that are joining NATO and the EU and the tensions there that we heard about in the previous presentation. I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment about those observations, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real shopping basket of points there. There are some underlying, I think, interesting points and some truths to Kagan's thesis, of course. But I think my underlying point was that if we trade in stereotypes, then we're not going to progress on our common concerns and agendas. And my fear is that Kagan helps to perpetuate some stereotypes. They are extremely interesting, but I'm not sure that they're that helpful to a constructive dialogue at the moment. There is some truth that Europe does think that it's living in a postmodern paradise, but I don't think it's true that the EU in particular has avoided or ducked the security implications of this. There are obvious problems, though, in addressing the security challenges that we face. There are obvious shortcomings as well. The most obvious one to my mind is that the EU has talked the talk, but is yet to really walk the walk. We have made all the great declarations. That's the easy part. The institutions, by and large, have been established and are working. But what is not there is the political will from the member states to really flesh out our abilities to be an active regional and international partner. And this is the big challenge, as I see it, for the European Union, and a potential cause of pessimism rather than optimism. If the member states simply fail to deliver on their promises and to make the European security and defence policy in particular a reality, then we will be constrained in our ability to influence international relations, and that would include to influence the transatlantic agenda. And in that regard, I am very concerned that there is very little evidence in the EU member states of a significant increase in defence expenditure, for example, with one or two exceptions. And we have to face the potential consequences of not doing that. And I don't see an active debate on that in the EU at the moment. As for the tensions between the EU and the accession countries, and particularly the candidates, yes, there are differences of opinion. And I think this is a learning process for the EU itself, to understand what their perceptions are of the world around them and to understand the implications of their history. And there are certainly examples when individual or groups of EU member states have been very insensitive to some of the concerns of the accession countries. With the candidates, there are also, I think, problems ahead, particularly dealing with Turkey. That has been and will remain a fundamental challenge for the EU. But I think, once again, it's important to be sensitive to Turkish concerns and also to recognize that Turkey is a vital security partner for the European Union. NATO likes to point out that 13 of 16 potential flashpoints are around Turkey's littoral. So yes, we have to have an active dialogue with them, and obviously our dialogue with Russia through the common strategy is also extremely important. So I remain, if I can put it this way, optimistic but concerned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.